In the gray, wet October of 2003, a 26-year-old woman named Delia Farrow stood at the edge of a bog that smelled like iron and old rain, and she made a decision that would make everyone who loved her genuinely worried about her state of mind. She had driven 4 hours north of Ottawa in a borrowed pickup truck with a cracked windshield and a heater that only worked on the passenger side. The land she had come to see was 40 acres of Canadian shield muskeg, a stretch of saturated peat and standing water and scrubby black spruce that the provincial government had been trying to offload for 11 years without a single serious offer. The listing had been so old it had yellowed in the real estate binder. The agent, a Mr. Pelletier whose face suggested he had seen many disappointing things in his career, handed her a pair of rubber boots from the back of his car without being asked. He had learned to keep them there. "The access road floods every spring," he said, watching her pull on the boots. "The peat layer is 3 to 5 meters deep in places. There's no hydro to the property line. The well that was drilled in 1987 hit sulfur water at 60 feet, and they abandoned it." He paused as if deciding whether to continue. "Mrs. Farrow, I want to be straightforward with you. I have shown this parcel to 11 prospective buyers. 8 of them turned around at the access road. The other 3 walked in about 200 meters and left." Delia wasn't listening in the way he meant her to listen. She was looking at the particular way the sedge grass grew in low, sweeping lines that curved toward a central depression. She was looking at the way the water sat, still and dark and patient, in a series of shallow basins connected by thin threads of natural channel. She was looking at the black spruce, how their roots gripped the peat like fingers. She was reading something he couldn't see. "What's the sulfur water situation at depth?" she asked. "Below 90 feet? Mr. Pelletier blinked. I'd have to look into that." "I'll take it," she said. He actually laughed. Not unkindly, but the way a person laughs when they mishear something. "I'm sorry, I'll take it at the listed price." She looked at him then. "Can we do the paperwork today?" The thing about Delia Farrow was that she had not arrived at this bog accidentally. She had been pointed here in the way that a compass needle doesn't choose north, but is built to find it. Her grandmother, Vera Farrow, had farmed the Lake Huron shoreline for 40 years. Not the good land either. Vera had inherited from her own mother a strip of clay-heavy Georgian Bay shore that no one else wanted, too wet in spring in August. The soil pale and compacted and reluctant. Her neighbors, men with black soil operations to the east, had watched Vera with the particular patience of people waiting for a natural correction to occur. The correction never came. Vera spent 30 years making that land into something, and she did it by refusing to fight it. Where other farmers installed tile drainage and forced the water off their property, Vera studied where the water went on its own. She mapped it. She learned which depressions held water longest, and she turned those into cranberry plots. Tart, difficult, profitable. She learned which rises drained fastest, and she grew market vegetables there. She learned that the clay, which everyone called a liability, held nutrients the way a vault holds gold if you fed it the right organic material to break it open. Vera kept notebooks, cheap, spiral-bound things she bought by the dozen at the IGA in town, filled with the kind of handwriting that gets small and careful when the thought is important. She wrote about soil temperature and frost dates and the behavior of certain beetles. She wrote about crop rotation and the way a field changes when you let clover winter over, rather than turning it under. She wrote about failure, too, with the same calm attention she gave to everything else. Failure, in Vera's notebooks, was just information that arrived in an uncomfortable way. Delia had grown up reading those notebooks the way other children read comics. She would sit at her grandmother's kitchen table in Weirton on summer afternoons while Vera made tea and explained what she had meant by a particular entry. The clay wants to hold. Work with that, not against it. A wet year isn't a disaster. It's a question the land is asking you. Figure out what it needs when it's full, and you'll know what to grow there. When Vera died in the spring of 2001, the farm went to Delia's uncle, who sold it inside of 4 months. The equipment, the buildings, the land itself, all of it dispersed. What came to Delia was 2 cardboard boxes of the notebooks and a small inheritance her grandmother had kept in a separate account, apart from the farm assets, as if she had always known the land would go elsewhere and had made other arrangements. The inheritance was $43,000. It was not enough to buy productive farmland anywhere in Ontario, but it was, as it turned out, enough to buy 40 acres of muskeg in a township so far north that the nearest Tim Hortons was a 40-minute drive on a provincial highway. Delia's mother did not take the news well. Her name was Patricia Farrow, and she was a practical woman who had watched her own mother spend a lifetime coaxing difficult land into production, and had drawn from that experience a different lesson than the one Delia had absorbed. Patricia had concluded that the smart move was to move away from difficult things, not toward them. She had a good position at an insurance firm in Canada. She drove a sensible car. She looked at her daughter standing in her kitchen explaining the muskeg purchase and felt the specific dread of watching someone you love make an irreversible mistake in real time. "Delia," she said carefully, "muskeg. You bought muskeg. I bought 40 acres of swamp. You bought a swamp with Mum's money." Patricia set down her tea. "Your grandmother worked 40 years on hard land, and she did it. She really did it. But, Delia, she had neighbors. She had a well that worked. You're going up there alone to what? Exactly. What grows in a peat bog?" "Sphagnum moss," Delia said. "Bog rosemary. Leatherleaf. Wild blueberries in the right spots." She paused. "Cranberries, cranberries," Patricia repeated, in the tone of a person hearing a word for the first time in a new and terrible context. "And ginseng. American ginseng will grow in the right peat conditions. It sells for, Delia. Mum, I know what I'm doing." Patricia looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked away. "I hope so," she said. "I truly hope so. Let me tell you something about the culture of agricultural communities in Northern Ontario. The wisdom there is old and earned and very specific to place. The farmers and trappers and woodlot operators who have worked that land for generations know what survives there and what doesn't. They have paid for that knowledge with failed seasons and flooded basements and equipment left rusting in back fields. When someone comes from the south, from the city's orbit, and buys land that locals have watched sit unsold for a decade, the response is not hostility. It is something more patient and more deflating than that. It is the quiet certainty of people who already know the ending of the story they're watching begin. The closest neighbor was a man named Mr. Quenville, who ran a woodlot operation and a small cow-calf operation on the adjacent quarter section. He was 62 years old, broad across the shoulders, and possessed of the economy of speech that comes from decades of working alone. He came by the property the week after closing, not to welcome her, but to see for himself that the rumor was true. He stood at the edge of the access road and looked at the bog, and then at Delia, the way a doctor might look at an X-ray and a patient in the same careful sequence. "You're going to try to farm this," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am going to farm it," Delia said. He looked back at the bog. "Cranberries need flooded beds. You haven't got the infrastructure for controlled flooding." "Not yet. The sulfur water. I drilled a test bore at 110 feet. Clean water at depth. The sulfur layer is between 50 and 90 feet. I'm commissioning a cased well next month. Mr. Quenville was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who wasted a surprise, but something shifted in his face. What else are you planning to plant in there? I'll put sphagnum beds along the natural channels for the first 2 years. Sphagnum is the slow crop, but it's the foundation crop. It holds moisture, it acidifies, it builds the bed chemistry for everything that comes after. Then I'll layer in cultivated cranberries in the main basins. Once those are established, she paused, ginseng under the black spruce canopy along the north edge. Wild ginseng prefers acidic, shaded, peat-rich soil. I have about 6 acres of that condition up there. He looked at her for a long time. How old are you? 26. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You've got a long learning curve ahead of you, I know. He nodded once and drove away. She would come to understand later that this was close to the highest form of respect Mr. Quenville was capable of extending to a newcomer in the first conversation. The others were less restrained. When Delia came into town for supplies, hardware, peat amendment, lengths of black irrigation pipe, the feed store counter was a reliable source of opinion. The man who ran it, a Mr. Deschaines whose family had operated the store for 3 generations, listened to her supply lists with the expression of a man trying very hard to be neutral. Sphagnum cultivation, he repeated, writing it on the order form. Never had anyone ask for that before, I imagine not. There was a fellow tried wild blueberries on similar ground about 20 years back. Mr. Deschaines offered, in a tone that implied this story did not have a happy ending. Didn't manage the water table. Got it up for the berry season and couldn't get it back down before freeze. Lost the crop 2 years running and sold the land. Delia nodded. I appreciate you telling me that. She meant it. That was exactly the kind of information that didn't exist in any textbook. He seemed mildly surprised that she had received the story as useful rather than discouraging. He gave her the supply order a day earlier than he'd said he would. She would only understand later that this was his version of acknowledgement. Now, let me explain what Delia was actually attempting, because it was more than just a farming plan. It was a philosophy applied to an ecosystem. Most people, when they look at a peat bog, see waste ground. They see standing water and stunted trees and mud that wants to swallow your boots. What Vera's notebooks had taught Delia to see was a system that had been optimizing itself for 10,000 years. The peat, the compressed, saturated dead organic matter that could go 3 to 5 meters deep, was not dead. It was a slow library. Every plant that fell into it, every season of moss growth and decay, had left its chemical record behind. The result was a substrate of extraordinary complexity and, in the right hands, extraordinary fertility for the specific crops that evolved alongside it. The sphagnum moss was not a commercial crop, in the way a layperson might think of one. It was an investment in the soil's future. Living sphagnum moss can hold up to 20 times its own weight in water. It maintains the acidic pH that cranberries and ginseng require. It insulates root systems through freeze-thaw cycles. Most importantly, it repairs itself. Once established, a sphagnum bed needs almost nothing. It is perhaps the most efficient ground cover in the boreal ecosystem. Delia was not planting a crop. She was building a platform. The cranberries would come second. Not the fast-producing commercial varieties that the large operations in BC and Quebec used in conventional flooded beds. Delia was working with heritage varieties, slower to produce, more disease-resistant, adapted to the specific microclimate of the Northern Shield. The yield per acre would be lower in the first 5 years. After that, the yield curve would invert. The ginseng was the long bet. American ginseng takes 4 to 6 years to reach marketable root size. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be forced. It will not grow in compacted or chemically managed soil. It requires the very specific conditions that Delia's 6 acres of black spruce understory happened to provide naturally. Dappled shade, acidic peat, good drainage without dryness, and the absence of the synthetic inputs that conventional agriculture relied on. A mature ginseng root in premium condition sold to Ontario specialty herbalists and Asian export buyers for prices that sounded, when Delia quoted them, like she was making them up. She was not making them up. The first year was the kind of year that breaks people. Not dramatically. There were no floods, no catastrophic failures, no single terrible event that Etzron could point to and say, there, that is when it went wrong. It was simply the grinding accumulation of physical difficulty and financial pressure, and the quiet weight of everyone else's certainty that this would not work. The well commission ran over budget by $4,000. The access road required regrading twice after spring thaw. The sphagnum plug order from a Nova Scotia supplier arrived 3 weeks late in the heat, and 15% of the plugs were dead on arrival. She replanted the dead sections by hand, twice in rain and in sun, wearing chest waders in water that stayed cold enough in the bog to be genuinely painful. Her back ached with the specific constancy of back pain that becomes, after a while, not a complaint but a condition, a feature of your daily life that you stop reporting to anyone because it's always there. She was living in a second-hand 12-by-20 camp trailer she had bought for $6,000 and parked on the one dry rise at the southwest corner of the property. She heated it with a propane stove. She showered at Mr. Quenville's barn when he wasn't around, because he had told her she could use the utility sink, and she had quietly understood this to mean the outdoor shower his farmhands used, though neither of them had said so explicitly. There was an understanding between them that required very few words, which suited them both. She tracked every dollar, not in a spreadsheet. She had tried that and found it too abstract, too distant from the physical reality of what the money represented. She kept a notebook, a cheap spiral-bound one, bought at the IGA without any conscious thought about where she had learned to do that. October, $840 on sphagnum plugs replacement. November, $320 on pipe fittings for the water management system. December, $100 on propane. February, $430 on a used pump motor that turned out to need another $280 in parts before it would run. The numbers accumulated, patient and relentless in her small, careful handwriting. Her neighbor, 2 properties down. A man named 2 properties down, Tane, who kept horses and had opinions, drove past her access road with some regularity. He had at some point made it known at the feed store that he thought the whole enterprise was what he called Southern money chasing a Northern dream. He did not say this to Delia directly. It reached her through the particular acoustical properties of a small community where information travels through casual sentences and grocery store aisles and the spaces between sentences at the gas station. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Imagine going out every morning before the light is fully up into cold that in February goes down to -30 with the wind, and spending 8 hours doing physical work in standing water, and then coming inside to a 12-by-20 trailer and heating a can of soup and writing down in a notebook that you spent $430 on a pump motor, and knowing with the full cognitive awareness of an intelligent adult that the people around you consider this a prolonged act of self-defeat, not out of cruelty, just out of what they believe, based on everything they have seen and learned to be obvious fact. Imagine living inside that, day after day, and then imagine choosing, in the gray light of February, to go back out in the morning That was Delia Farrow's life for 2 full years. The sphagnum beds took hold slowly, but they took hold. By the second spring, the main channels were showing the particular living green that meant the moss was growing rather than merely surviving. There is a difference, a visible one, once you know what you're looking at, between moss that is hanging on and moss that is flourishing. Delia knew what flourishing looked like from Vera's notebooks. She recognized it when she saw it. She wrote in her own notebook, beds 1 through 4 showing active growth, channel margins holding moisture well, pH reading 4.1, exactly where I need it. The land is accepting this. She did not share this with anyone. The habit of privacy had grown in her not from mistrust, but from the simple understanding that small victories, reported too early, invite other people's doubt into a space where doubt is not useful. The first cranberry year, the 4th year after purchase, produced a partial crop. About 40% of projected yield, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the quality. The fruit from her heritage varieties was dense and dark and intensely flavored in a way that commercial cranberries grown in conventional beds are not. She brought a sample to a specialty food buyer in Ottawa she had been corresponding with for 2 years, a woman named Miss Tran, who sourced for high-end restaurants and specialty grocers. Miss Tran ate one off the sample tray and was quiet for a moment in a way that made Delia very still. "Where did you source the variety?" Miss Tran asked. "Heritage stock from a family operation in PEI that's been growing the same line since the 1940s, and the growing conditions, open peat bog, no synthetic inputs, mineral-rich peat substrate, harvested by hand." Miss Tran looked at the cranberry in her hand. "I can place everything you can produce," she said, "at a price I suspect you'll find reasonable." She named a number per pound. Delia kept her face very still and said that she found it reasonable. She drove 4 hours back to the property, with her hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than necessary. The ginseng was 6 years away from its first harvest, but she checked on it regularly, which really meant walking into the spruce shade and crouching down and looking at the growth, the reddish stems, the compound leaves, the way the ground smelled of iron and something older than iron. She kept notes on each plant's progress by row. She did not calculate what the harvest would be worth, because that felt like counting something before it existed, which her grandmother had always said was a way of jinxing both the counting and the thing. Year 5 was the first year she paid herself a wage, a small one, not enough that she mentioned it to her mother, but enough that it was real. The transformation in the community's perception was not sudden. It was instead a slow shift in the quality of silence. Mr. Deschaines at the feed store stopped offering cautionary historical anecdotes. Mr. Quinville started asking specific questions rather than making general observations. The feed store conversations, when they reached her property at all, had a different frequency to them. Not praise, it was too soon for that, and this was not a community given to premature praise, but the tone of certainty about her failure had become a tone of uncertainty about everything, which was its own kind of progress. In the 7th year, the ginseng came in. I am going to ask you to imagine what a mature American ginseng's root looks like when it comes out of acidic peat after 6 years of growth in ideal conditions. It is not the pale, thin, commercially cultivated root you might have seen in a supplement store. This root is dense and forked and darker, the color of old wood, with a girth that fills your palm. The smell is mineral and green and very old. Delia pulled the first one in early September, kneeling in the spruce shadow, with her hands in the cool peat, and she sat there for a moment with it in both hands. She was 33 years old. She had been working toward this root, not literally, but toward what it represented, for 7 years. She pulled the rest of that week. 5 rows, then 6. The roots were graded and dried and packaged according to the protocol she had spent 2 years developing. She had by then established relationships with 2 specialty herbalist distributors in Toronto and a direct export contact in Vancouver who worked with traditional medicine practitioners. The price per pound for premium-grade wild simulated ginseng was not a price that most people in that part of northern Ontario would associate with any agricultural product. When Mr. Deschaines, who had heard through the community's unseen network that the ginseng harvest had been substantial, asked her directly at the counter one afternoon whether the numbers people were mentioning were accurate, Delia said that she thought the numbers had probably been slightly exaggerated. This was, in the technical sense, true. The real numbers were somewhat higher. That fall, Mr. Quenneville came by the property on a Tuesday afternoon in November. He stood at the edge of the sphagnum beds, vivid green and living against the frost-darkened landscape, and looked out at what was, by then, a property that did not resemble the bog he had assessed 11 years earlier. The cranberry beds in the low basins were drained for winter, the channel system visible and functional, and clearly designed by someone who understood water. The black spruce stand on the north edge had a different quality to it now, denser and darker, at ground level, the understory restored. He stood there for a while, then he said, "Profit per acre," Delia told him. He was quiet for a long time. Mr. Quenneville was not a man who rushed toward the thing he wanted to say. He let it come in its own time. "I told my son about your operation," he said finally. "He's got 60 acres of clay pan down near Sudbury. Nobody wants it. He's been leasing it for hay and losing money on the lease." He looked at her. "Would you be willing to talk to him?" Delia looked out at her property. She thought about a spiral-bound notebook and a kitchen table in Wyerton, and the smell of tea, and the sound of a pen moving across cheap paper. She thought about the particular patience required to read information that arrives in uncomfortable ways. "Tell him to bring his soil reports," she said, "and any water movement data he has. We'll figure out what the land is asking for." Mr. Quenneville nodded. The conversation was, by any measure, over, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood there another moment, looking at the beds. "I was wrong about this place," he said. It was 4 words, delivered to the middle distance, in the same tone he used for weather observations and equipment assessments. But Delia understood that for a man like Mr. Quenneville, those 4 words represented a significant crossing of distance. "No," she said, "you were right about what it was. You just couldn't see what it was going to become." "Not exactly. I just trusted what my grandmother knew." He left without fanfare. She watched his truck disappear down the access road and then looked back at the property. The light at that time of year in northern Ontario arrives low and long, and it was doing that now, turning the sphagnum an almost impossible green against the gray sky. She walked the perimeter of the main beds the way she did every evening, checking water levels, checking the moss. She pulled out her notebook and wrote down what she saw, not for any particular purpose, just because her grandmother had taught her that the land had its own story and the least you could do was pay attention to it. Over the years that followed, things changed in that part of Ontario in a way that changes usually in agricultural communities, slowly, with resistance, and then all at once. Other marginal landowners started asking about the economics of sphagnum, cultivation. A young couple bought a similar parcel 3 townships over and drove out to see Delia before they signed the papers. She showed them the beds and the channels, and the system her grandmother's notebooks had pointed her toward. She told them what she had learned in the first year that no book had told her. She told them what she had gotten wrong in the second year and how she had corrected it. She told them about the pump motor and the propane bills, and the February mornings when the distance between the trailer and the bog felt like more than it was. She also told them what the land looked like when you stopped fighting it and started listening. And that was the harder thing to describe. But it was also the thing that mattered most. There are places in Canada where agricultural land is easy, where the soil is deep and the drainage is good, and the growing season is long, and generations of farming have refined exactly what works and exactly what doesn't. This is valuable country. But there is another kind of land, marginal land, difficult land, the kind that sits in listing binders for 11 years. And that land has its own form of intelligence. It has been shaped by the particular pressures of its specific place. The bog knows things that the deep black soil of the prairies doesn't need to know. It knows how to hold water through a drought. It knows how to maintain chemistry in a way that conventional soil cannot. It knows how to sustain life in the boreal dark. Most people look at that kind of land and see a problem to be solved, a liability to be written off, a mistake to be avoided. Vera Farrow had looked at her gray clay shore and seen a partnership waiting to be entered. She had passed that way of seeing in 2 cardboard boxes of spiral-bound notebooks to a granddaughter who drove a borrowed truck with a cracked windshield 4 hours north in October, and who stood at the edge of a bog that smelled like iron and old rain, and saw what the land was asking for. What they called swamp, she called potential. What they called worthless, she called unread. What they called a young woman wasting an inheritance, the land was already quietly, patiently turning into a harvest that would outlast all of them.